I won't say it again, old man. Charge! Attack Max!
He knows better than that, officer. He knows who the real enemy is.
Police ordered the canine to attack an elderly veteran, but the dog sat and faced north without moving. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse plaza as 78-year-old Frank Miller approached the imposing granite steps, his worn wooden cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete. The retired sergeant major moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had spent 3 decades training military working dogs, his weathered olive drab field jacket bearing the faded outline of a unit patch that few civilians would recognize. Frank had come to the courthouse for a routine matter filing paperwork for a land dispute involving his small farm outside the city. What should have been a simple administrative task was complicated by the crowd of protesters that had gathered in the plaza, their chants echoing off the courthouse walls as police officers worked to maintain order behind temporary barricades. Officer Ben Carter, barely 2 years out of the academy, watched the crowd with nervous energy, his hand resting on the leash of his canine partner Max. The powerful German shepherd sat at attention beside his handler, his intelligent dark eyes scanning the crowd with the alertness that marked him as a graduate of the military working dog program at Fort Talon. Max had been with Carter for just over a year, transferred from the military to civilian law enforcement as part of a surplus equipment program. The dog's training was impeccable, his obedience absolute, and his ability to detect threats unquestioned. What Carter didn't know was that Max's bloodline had been personally developed by the same man who was now walking slowly toward the courthouse entrance. "Sir, you need to stay back from the barricade," Carter called out as Frank approached, his voice carrying the edge of someone looking for trouble where none existed. Frank paused, leaning on his cane as he assessed the young officer. "I'm just here to file some paperwork," he said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Court clerk's office." But Carter was already on edge from the protest, and Frank's calm demeanor somehow irritated him further. "I said stay back. You're too close to the restricted area." Frank took a step backward, his movement slow and deliberate. "No problem, officer. Just trying to get to the courthouse." Max's ears perked up at the sound of Frank's voice, something familiar registering in the dog's highly trained mind. The German shepherd's head tilted slightly, his nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that triggered memories from his early training days. What happened next would challenge everything Officer Carter thought he knew about his canine partner and would remind everyone present that some bonds transcend simple commands and protocols. Officer Carter's agitation continued to escalate as he misread Frank's calm compliance as defiance. The young officer had been looking for an opportunity to demonstrate his authority, and the elderly man with the cane seemed like an easy target. "I told you to move back, and you're still standing there," Carter said, his voice rising. "Are you having trouble understanding simple instructions?" Frank remained perfectly still, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Years of military training had taught him how to de-escalate situations, but he could see that this young officer was determined to create a confrontation. "Officer, I'm complying with your instructions," Frank said quietly. "I'm not causing any trouble. I just need to get inside to file some paperwork." But Carter was beyond reason now, his inexperience and nervous energy combining into a dangerous cocktail of misplaced authority. He looked down at Max, who was still sitting at attention, but whose focus seemed strangely divided between his handler and the elderly man. "You want to do this the hard way?" Carter demanded, his hand tightening on Max's leash. "Fine, we'll do this the hard way." The crowd of protesters had begun to notice the confrontation, some pulling out phones to record what appeared to be an unnecessary escalation between a police officer and an elderly civilian. The tension in the plaza was palpable as people sensed that something was about to go very wrong. Carter looked down at Max, his voice taking on the sharp command tone he had been taught in canine handler training. "Max, watch him." The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his body tensing as he prepared to follow his handler's command. Max had been trained to respond instantly to such orders, to trust his handler's judgment about threats and appropriate responses. But as Max looked at Frank, something extraordinary happened. The dog's head tilted again, and his intelligent eyes seemed to be processing information that went beyond his standard training protocols. Frank's scent, his posture, his calm energy, everything about him was triggering recognition in the dog's memory. Frank, sensing the dangerous escalation, slowly raised one hand in a gesture of peaceful intent. It was a movement he had taught countless military working dogs over the years, a signal that meant, "No threat, stand down." Max's response was immediate and unmistakable. The powerful German shepherd, who had been tense to spring into action, suddenly relaxed. His ears moved from the aggressive forward position to a more neutral stance, and his tail, which had been rigid with alertness, began a slow, uncertain wag. "What the hell?" Carter muttered, looking down at his partner in confusion. "Max, I said watch him." But Max was no longer focused on Carter's commands. The dog was staring at Frank with an intensity that suggested recognition, his head tilting from side to side as if trying to place a familiar face from long ago. Frank remained perfectly still, understanding that any sudden movement could trigger the dog's training and override whatever recognition was taking place. He had seen this before, working dogs who remembered their original trainers even years later, their deeper conditioning overriding more recent commands when they sensed a conflict between what they were being told to do and what their instincts told them was right. The moment stretched out like an eternity, with Carter growing more frustrated, the crowd watching in fascination, and Max caught between his recent training and something much deeper, a connection to the man who had shaped not just his bloodline, but the very foundations of how military working dogs were trained to think and respond. The tension in the courthouse plaza reached a breaking point as Officer Carter's frustration boiled over into something dangerous. His inexperience and wounded pride combined into a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Max, sick him!" Carter shouted, using the attack command that should have sent his canine partner charging toward Frank with the full force of his military training. Max lunged forward as his conditioning demanded, his powerful body moving with the precision and speed that had made him a top graduate of the military working dog program. But then something unprecedented happened that would be talked about in canine training circles for years to come. The German shepherd stopped mid-charge, his paws skidding slightly on the concrete as he came to an abrupt halt just feet from Frank. Max's head tilted again, and he looked directly into Frank's eyes with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Then, in a movement that defied everything Carter thought he knew about his partner, Max calmly sat down and turned to face due north, his body rigid with attention, but his focus completely removed from the confrontation. "What the hell is he doing?" Carter demanded, yanking on Max's leash. "Max, I gave you a command attack." But Max remained motionless, facing north with the kind of unwavering focus that marked elite military training. The dog's ears were forward, his posture alert, but he showed no aggression toward Frank whatsoever. Frank slowly lowered his raised hand, and Max immediately dropped into a formal stay position, his body language communicating complete calm and control. The elderly veteran's eyes widened with recognition and something approaching amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank murmured loud enough for nearby observers to hear. He remembers. Carter was now pulling frantically on Max's leash, his commands becoming increasingly desperate as his partner completely ignored him. "Max, heel attack, do something!" The commotion had attracted the attention of other officers, including a security supervisor who approached with the measured gait of someone accustomed to handling crisis situations. The supervisor, a man in his 50s, with gray at his temples and the unmistakable bearing of ex-military, took in the scene with professional assessment. "What's the situation here, Carter?" the supervisor asked, his eyes moving between the agitated young officer, the calm elderly man, and the German shepherd, who was still sitting motionless and facing north. "My canine won't follow commands," Carter said, his voice tight with embarrassment and confusion. "I ordered him to apprehend this subject, and he just stopped." The supervisor looked more closely at Frank, noting the faded military patches on his jacket and the way he carried himself, despite his age. "Sir, could I get your name?" "Frank Miller," Frank replied quietly. "Sergeant Major, retired." The supervisor's eyes widened with recognition. "Sergeant Major Frank Miller from the Joint Service K-9 program at Fort Benning." Frank nodded, and the supervisor's entire demeanor changed. He looked down at Max, who was still maintaining his northward vigil, and understanding dawned on his face. "This is Max, isn't it?" the supervisor said. "Transferred from Fort Talon about a year ago. Military Working Dog Program." "That's right," Frank said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "I trained his bloodline for over 20 years. His great-grandfather was one of my first breeding pairs." The supervisor turned to Carter, his expression serious. "Officer Carter, you need to understand what just happened here. Your K-9 didn't malfunction. He performed exactly as he was trained to. Sergeant Major Miller developed the protocols that Max was originally trained under, including independent threat assessment." Carter looked confused and defensive. "What does that mean?" Frank stepped forward slightly, his movement causing Max to turn his head, but not his body. "It means Max evaluated the situation and determined that I wasn't a threat. The northward orientation is something I taught all my dogs. It's their way of refusing an inappropriate command." "Refusing a command?" Carter's voice rose with indignation. "He's supposed to obey me." "He's supposed to think," Frank corrected gently. "A good working dog doesn't just follow orders blindly. He assesses threats, evaluates situations, and makes decisions based on his training and instincts. Max looked at me and saw no threat, so he refused your command to attack." The supervisor nodded in agreement. "The military working dog program emphasizes independent thinking for exactly this reason. Dogs can sometimes see things that humans miss, and they need to be able to override commands that don't make tactical sense. By now, a crowd had gathered, and several people were recording the extraordinary scene with their phones. The image of a police canine calmly sitting and facing north while ignoring his handler's commands was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Frank whistled softly, a sound that was barely audible, but caused Max to immediately turn and walk calmly to his side, where the dog sat with perfect discipline. The unprecedented scene in the courthouse plaza had attracted not only a growing crowd of onlookers, but also the attention of local news crews who had been covering the protest. The image of a police canine refusing to attack an elderly veteran was exactly the kind of story that would capture national attention, and Officer Carter was beginning to understand that his career was in serious jeopardy. "This is a disaster," Carter muttered to himself as he watched Frank calmly interact with Max, the dog, responding to the elderly man's subtle commands with a precision that Carter had never achieved despite a year of working with his partner. The security supervisor, whose name tag identified him as Sergeant Williams, was already on his radio coordinating damage control. "We need the watch commander down here immediately," he said, "and get me the chief on the line. This is going to be a media situation." Within minutes, the courthouse plaza was swarming with additional police personnel, including the watch commander and eventually Police Chief Patricia Martinez herself. Chief Martinez, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, took one look at the scene and immediately understood the implications. "Sergeant Williams briefed me," she ordered, her eyes taking in the crowd of recording bystanders, the news cameras, and the elderly man who was now calmly demonstrating commands with a police canine who had refused to attack him. "Chief, this is Sergeant Major Frank Miller, retired," Williams explained. "He's the original trainer for Max's bloodline and the developer of the military working dog protocols that Max was trained under. Officer Carter ordered Max to attack Sergeant Miller, and the dog refused, using a signal that Miller taught him to indicate an inappropriate command." Chief Martinez felt her stomach drop as she realized the full scope of what had happened. A police officer had ordered a canine to attack a decorated military veteran, and the dog had essentially testified to the inappropriateness of the command by refusing to obey. "How bad is this going to get?" she asked Williams quietly. "It's already viral," Williams replied, showing her his phone where videos of the incident were being shared across social media platforms. "The story is being picked up by national news outlets. We're looking at a major public relations crisis." Meanwhile, Frank was dealing with his own crisis. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent his retirement years living quietly on his small farm, and the implications of what had happened were only beginning to sink in. Sergeant Major Chief Martinez approached him with the respect due to his rank and experience. "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. Officer Carter's actions were completely inappropriate, and we will be conducting a full investigation." Frank looked at the chief with tired eyes. "Ma'am, I'm not looking for apologies or investigations. I just wanted to file some paperwork and go home." "I understand that, sir, but this situation has implications that go beyond today's incident. Your K-9's response has raised questions about our training protocols and the appropriateness of our commands." The crisis deepened when reporters began asking pointed questions about Police K-9 training, the use of force against elderly citizens, and the apparent disconnect between Officer Carter and his partner. The story was being framed as an indictment of police training and judgment, with Max's refusal to attack being portrayed as evidence that even a dog could recognize inappropriate use of force. Chief Martinez called out a reporter from Channel 7 News. "What does it say about your department's training when a police dog refuses to follow orders because those orders are inappropriate?" Chief Martinez found herself in an impossible position. Defending Carter's actions would make the department look callous and militaristic, but criticizing them would undermine the authority of her officers and their canine units. Frank, seeing the chief's dilemma, made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. "If I may," he said, stepping forward to address the gathered media, "I want everyone to understand that Max didn't disobey his handler," Frank said, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "He performed exactly as he was trained to perform. Military working dogs are taught to think, to assess situations, and to make independent judgments about appropriate responses." Max looked at me and correctly determined that I posed no threat, so he refused a command that didn't match the tactical situation. Frank's explanation began to shift the narrative from police misconduct to the sophistication of canine training, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about Officer Carter's judgment and experience with his partner. The media attention surrounding the courthouse incident continued to intensify over the following days, with Frank Miller's story becoming a national symbol of the complex relationship between law enforcement military veterans and the highly trained animals that serve alongside them. Police Chief Martinez found herself fielding calls from news outlets across the country, all wanting to understand how a police K-9 had essentially overruled his handler's command. Frank, meanwhile, was struggling with the unwanted attention. His small farm, which had been his refuge since retirement, was now surrounded by reporters and curiosity seekers. The phone calls were constant, and the requests for interviews were overwhelming for someone who had spent the last 8 years in peaceful anonymity. "I never wanted to be the center of a controversy," Frank told his neighbor, retired Army Colonel James Patterson, during one of their morning coffee sessions. "I just wanted Max to be properly understood." Patterson, who had served with Frank during their military careers, understood his friend's dilemma. "Frank, whether you wanted it or not, you've become the voice for something important. The way that dog responded to you has opened up conversations about training judgment and the relationship between handlers and their K-9 partners." The climactic moment came when Chief Martinez made an unprecedented decision. Rather than waiting for the controversy to die down or trying to manage it through traditional public relations channels, she decided to embrace the opportunity for genuine reform and improvement. "Sergeant Major Miller," Chief Martinez said during a phone call to Frank's farm, "I have a proposition for you. Our department needs help understanding the kind of training protocols that produced Max's response. Would you consider working with us as a civilian advisor?" Frank was initially reluctant. "Chief, I'm 78 years old and retired. I'm not looking to get back into training programs." "I'm not asking you to train dogs," Martinez clarified. "I'm asking you to help us understand the dogs we already have." Max's response revealed that there's a gap between what our K-9s are capable of and what our handlers understand about their capabilities. The proposal was intriguing. Frank had spent his retirement years watching from a distance as civilian law enforcement adopted military working dogs without fully understanding the sophisticated training and decision-making capabilities these animals possessed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Frank asked. "A complete review of our canine program," Martinez replied. "I want you to evaluate our training protocols, assess our handler-dog relationships, and help us develop better communication between our officers and their partners." Frank considered the offer carefully. The incident with Max had revealed something troubling, that Officer Carter had been working with his partner for over a year without understanding the dog's true capabilities or the signals he was trained to give. "I'll do it," Frank said finally, "but with conditions. No politics, no media circus, just protocols and training. And Max needs to be reassigned to a handler who understands what he's capable of." Chief Martinez agreed immediately. "Done. And Sergeant Major, I want you to know that Officer Carter has requested the reassignment himself. He's realized that he wasn't the right match for a dog with Max's level of training." The climactic transformation began immediately. Frank started working with the police department's K-9 unit, not as a trainer, but as an interpreter, helping handlers understand the subtle communications their partners were capable of. He discovered that several other dogs in the program had been exhibiting behaviors that their handlers had misinterpreted as disobedience, when they were actually sophisticated responses to inappropriate commands. Max was reassigned to Officer Sarah Chen, a veteran officer with military experience who immediately recognized the dog's exceptional capabilities. Under Chen's partnership, Max flourished, demonstrating levels of tactical thinking and independent judgment that amazed the entire department. But the most significant change was in the training protocols themselves. Frank worked with the department to implement what became known as the Miller Method, an approach that emphasized partnership and communication between handlers and dogs rather than simple command and obedience. "A good working dog is not a robot," Frank would tell the handlers during training sessions. "He's a partner with his own intelligence instincts and judgment. Your job is not to control him, but to communicate with him and trust his assessment of situations." The climax of the entire transformation came 6 months later, when Officer Carter, who had been reassigned to community outreach, approached Frank with a request that surprised everyone. Sergeant Major on Carter, said his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been there during their first encounter. "I want to apologize for what happened at the courthouse. I didn't understand what Max was trying to tell me, and I let my ego override his judgment." Frank looked at the young officer, seeing genuine remorse and growth. "Officer Carter, the best apology is learning from the experience. What matters now is that you understand the difference between commanding and communicating." Carter nodded. "I've been working with the community outreach program, and I've learned a lot about reading situations and understanding when force is appropriate. I want to ask if you'd consider letting me observe your training sessions, not to work with K-9s again, but to understand what I missed." Frank agreed, and Carter became one of the most dedicated students of the Miller Method, eventually becoming an instructor himself, teaching other officers about the importance of understanding their K-9 partners' capabilities and communications. The climax concluded with the unveiling of a bronze statue in the courthouse plaza, a German shepherd sitting calmly and facing north. The plaque beneath it read, "In recognition of the wisdom that transcends command and the loyalty that serves justice above all. 2 years after the incident that had changed everything, the courthouse plaza had become a pilgrimage site for canine handlers and dog trainers from around the world. The bronze statue of a German shepherd facing north had become a symbol of the sophisticated relationship between working dogs and their human partners, representing the importance of trust, communication, and mutual respect. Frank Miller, now 80, continued his work as a civilian advisor to police departments across the country, though he limited his travel and focused primarily on developing training materials and protocols that could be implemented remotely. The Miller method had been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 23 states, fundamentally changing how police canine units operated. Max, now working with Officer Chen, had become one of the most successful police dogs in the department's history. His ability to independently assess situations and communicate his findings to his handler had prevented numerous inappropriate uses of force and had led to the successful resolution of dozens of complex cases. Max doesn't just follow orders, Officer Chen would explain to visiting trainers. He evaluates situations and provides input. He's not just my partner, he's my advisor. Officer Carter had found his calling in community outreach and education. His experience with Max had taught him valuable lessons about humility, communication, and the importance of understanding rather than simply commanding. He now ran workshops for young officers about recognizing and respecting the expertise of their partners, both human and canine. I learned that real authority comes from understanding, not from giving orders, Carter would tell new recruits. Max taught me that lesson by refusing to follow a command that didn't make sense. Frank's small farm had returned to its peaceful routine, though he now shared it with Max on weekends, an arrangement that benefited both the dog and his original trainer. The two would spend hours working through the silent drills that had made Max's bloodline famous, maintaining the connection that transcended simple training. The impact of their story had spread far beyond law enforcement. Military working dog programs had adopted elements of the Miller method, and civilian dog trainers had embraced the philosophy of partnership over dominance. Good training teaches dogs to think, Frank would conclude his lectures. And good handlers learn to listen to what their partners are telling them. The elderly veteran who had just wanted to file paperwork had inadvertently revolutionized canine training, proving that sometimes the most important lessons come from the wisdom to recognize when a command should not be followed. This story demonstrates how true partnership between humans and animals is built on mutual respect, understanding, and the wisdom to recognize that intelligence and judgment exist in many forms.